Hi all. Um, so we're now going to do a little discussion of animal rights, how we should treat animals. Uh, so I had you read this piece, Puppies, Pigs, and People by Alistair Norcross. He's a professor at UC Boulder. He asks us to begin by considering a hypothetical story, a little thought experiment. Unfortunately, it is not going to turn out to be a very nice story. Consider Fred. One day, Fred receives a visit from the police. The police have shown up because Fred's neighbors called them. And Fred's neighbors called them because there have been strange sounds emanating from Fred's basement. Now, when they enter the basement, the police find the following very disturbing scene. 26 small wire cages, each containing a puppy, some whining, some whimpering, some howling. They range in age from newborn to about 6 months. Many of them have been mutilated. Urine and feces cover the bottom of the cages and the basement floor. Fred explains that he keeps the puppies for 26 weeks, then butchers them while holding them upside down. During their lives, he performs a series of mutilations on them, such as slicing off their noses and their paws with a hot knife without any form of anesthesia. Except for the mutilations, the puppies are never allowed out of the cages, which are barely big enough to hold them by the time they are 26 weeks old. The police, of course, are horrified by this. They charge Fred with animal abuse. The case hits the newspapers. The public is outraged. People want the government to throw the book at him. They say we need to change the law and institute tougher penalties for animal abuse. He's denounced as a vile sadist. So you can ask yourself what you think of Fred. My guess is that you would respond to Fred in roughly the way that the public responds to Fred in Norcross's story. You would think what Fred has done is monstrous, right? It's wrong. And not only is it wrong, it's very, very seriously wrong. It's not just, well, everybody makes mistakes, nobody's perfect. It's very, very seriously wrong. But when he goes to trial, Fred says, look, you guys have things all wrong. You don't understand. I have an excuse. Just hear me out. Fred is a great lover of chocolate. And a couple years ago, he was involved in a car accident which resulted in some head trauma. Upon his release, he visited his favorite restaurant and he ordered their famous rich dark chocolate mousse. Unfortunately, it turned out that he could no longer enjoy the taste of chocolate very much. It was slightly pleasant, it wasn't terrible, but it didn't have the intense chocolate flavor that it used to have. This was because of the brain damage from his car accident. Again, there were other things he could eat, but chocolate was always his favorite food, and this really bothers him. And so he visited a renowned gustatory neurologist, Dr. T. Budd. Extensive tests revealed that the accident had damaged the Godiva gland, which secretes cocamone, the hormone responsible for the experience of chocolate. So he suffered brain damage from his car accident, which renders him unable to get the intense chocolatey flavor that he used to enjoy. He asks, is there anything that can be done? And Dr. Budd tells him Well, until recently, we had no way to produce cocomone for you, but recently a chance discovery has altered the situation. Oh no. A forensic veterinary surgeon performing an autopsy on a severely abused puppy discovered high concentrations of cocomone, this hormone that lets you enjoy chocolate, in the puppy's brain. It turned out that puppies who do not normally produce cocomone could be stimulated to do so by extended periods of severe stress and suffering. And so Fred, he tells the court, can you imagine how terrible it was? I miss chocolate so much. There's something that can be done, but you can't go buy it in stores. It's not commercially produced or anything. And so Fred says, look, I did what any chocolate lover would do. I set up my own collection lab, and I learned that if you make a puppy suffer for 6 months and then kill them, you can harvest enough cocomone for a week. And that's why he has 26 cages, one puppy for each week, right? Because they live for 6 months before he kills them. Fred says, look, you have to understand, I'm not a sadist, I'm not an animal abuser. If there were some way to artificially produce the cocomone, I would be quite happy to use that instead. I don't like the fact that the puppies suffer. I understand why you guys don't like it either. But you have to realize that my pleasure is at stake. I am a human being, and my pleasure, my ability to eat what I want and enjoy eating what I want is at stake. These puppies, meanwhile, of course they're cute, but they're just animals. And human beings are more important than animals, aren't they? He recognizes he doesn't need chocolate to live. He would probably be healthier if he cut chocolate out of his diet, honestly. But he thinks his life would be unacceptably impoverished without the experience of chocolate. And so he thinks his interests as a human being outweigh the suffering that this process causes to the puppies. Oops. Sorry, I just moved into another room there. So that's Fred's justification of his actions. He needs to torture these puppies to get cocomone, and he needs the cocomone to enjoy chocolate, and he thinks, look, human interests, more important than animal interests. You gotta do what you gotta do to get your chocolate fix. Sad that the puppies suffer, but, you can't really blame me, can you? And you can ask yourself, okay, so what do you think of Fred's justification? And of course, Norcross imagines you will not be moved even slightly, right? You're not going to think, oh, okay, well, he really enjoyed chocolate, whatever. No. We are horrified by Fred's behavior. We are unconvinced by his attempted justification. Of course, it is unfortunate for Fred that he can no longer enjoy the taste of chocolate. But that doesn't excuse the imposition of severe suffering on the puppies. I expect near universal agreement with this claim, the exceptions being those who are either inhumanly callous or thinking ahead and wish to avoid the following conclusion. So he imagines, look, everybody is going to agree that Fred's justification is bad, unless they are inhumanly callous, or they realize where Norcross is ultimately going with this, and they think, oh no, I better not agree with this premise that's going to lead me to this other conclusion I don't like, right? Surely he thinks no decent person would even contemplate torturing puppies merely to enhance a gustatory experience. Gustatory means having to do with eating and taste. That's what gustatory means. And so Norcross thinks, look, most people are going to agree with all this. It seems like he's probably right about that. But he thinks most people are hypocrites because they do something that at the end of the day is just as bad as what Fred does, maybe even worse. Billions of animals endure intense suffering every year because we want to eat them cheaply. Most of the chicken, veal, beef, and pork consumed in the U.S. comes from intensive confinement facilities in which the animals live cramped, stress-filled lives, endure unanesthetized mutilations. The vast majority of people would suffer no ill health from the elimination of meat from their diets. Quite the reverse. The supposed benefits from the system of factory farming, apart from the profits accruing to agribusiness, are increased levels of gustatory taste, pleasure for those who claim they couldn't enjoy a meat-free diet as much as their current meat-filled diets. If we're prepared to condemn Fred for torturing puppies merely to enhance his own gustatory experiences, shouldn't we similarly condemn the millions who purchase and consume factory-raised meat? Are there any morally significant differences between Fred's behavior and their behavior? He says, look, the overwhelming majority of Americans eat animal products from factory farms. He talks about meat. You could also include milk and eggs and things. Those are all produced in factory farms too. And, the overwhelming majority of things on the grocery store shelf or whatever are all produced in factory farms. In fact, chickens are treated by far the worst, and they're raised in much greater numbers. So eggs are one of the worst things you can buy from an animal welfare perspective. Chicken products and eggs are some of the worst things. But he's thinking, look, people buy this stuff. The vast majority of cases, they don't need it to survive or anything like that. Maybe you can come up with cases where people do, or okay, that's a little different. Vast majority of people don't need this to survive or anything like that. Don't need it to be healthy. In fact, they would probably be healthier if they ate less meat. They do it just because they want to eat these animal products, and they don't want to spend more money on them or anything like that. They do this just because they enjoy the taste. And so Norcross thinks, if we think that Fred's behavior is awful, doesn't it seem like we should think the ordinary American's behavior is comparably awful? If you're watching the slides at this point, there will be some unpleasant images coming up. I mean, nothing bloody or gory or graphic in that sense, but I guess you can just listen to the audio if you don't want to see these. These are going to be some pictures of factory farming to give you a sense of what Norcross is talking about here. So these are pigs in what are called gestation crates. They put pregnant pigs in these. You can see on the floor there's, dirt and excrement and things that have collected on the slats. You can see the crates are often too small for the pigs even to move or turn around or anything, and they're kept in these for long periods of time. I saw once some industry official, some agriculture industry official was asked about the fact that they can't turn around, and he said, well, who says the pigs want to turn around, Doesn't seem so good. There's a pig chewing on the bar, I guess. This is an aerial view. You can see they do this because you can fit vast numbers of animals into a confined space this way, right? You can imagine what it smells like in there, what it sounds like in there. Here are chickens. Again, you can see they're hoarded together in incredibly tight conditions. Often, chickens are kind of territorial, so if you put them in such tight conditions, they'll like peck each other to death. And so often, for instance, they get the tips of their beaks cut off, which their beaks, have nerve endings in them. So it's probably like getting your nose cut off or something like that without any anesthesia. This is when Norcross talks about Fred cutting the puppy's noses off without anesthesia. That's the analogy here. These are egg-laying hens. You can see, I'm not quite sure what's going on with this chicken's feathers. I think probably it's sort of torn them off because of mental stress. You can see that these chickens are in crates where they basically can't move. Yeah, there's another picture of them crammed in. These are when you produce eggs. When you hatch eggs to produce more egg-laying hens, you don't need nearly as many male chickens. Because one male chicken can impregnate a large number of female chickens. So when they hatch, they sort out the baby male chicks and kill them. These are being ground up, probably to be put into fertilizer or something. I don't know exactly. This is a dairy cow that is unable to stand up. That's, I think, a common problem for dairy cows. It's, I think, assumed that this is because of them standing on, hardwood slats a lot and it harms their hooves. I'm not sure if it's quite understood why this happens, but it's not very good. There are also, bulls get castrated without anesthesia, this sort of stuff. So you can see that it's not, it's not terribly pleasant, right? So that's all the pictures. You can see that it's not terribly pleasant, right? The animals that you most likely eat and that produce the eggs and milk and so forth that you most likely eat, unless you're very, very conscientious about where you're getting your food, are not treated very well. Now, we agreed that what Fred did was awful. We agreed that that ought to be illegal. But it looks like if we purchase factory farm products, we support this system that does equally terrible things to other animals. And so, you might ask, okay, this question that Norcross asked a minute ago, is there any difference between Fred's behavior and the behavior of the ordinary American? And he's going to consider a couple potential excuses, and he's going to reject each one in turn. So these are alleged differences you might point to say, well, what Fred does is terrible, what I do is not so terrible, and Norcross is going to say, no, none of these work. First of all, Fred tortures the puppies himself, whereas people who buy factory farm puppies, factory farm products, do not harm the animals directly themselves. They pay other people to do it. But you might think, well, that hardly seems like it makes a big difference, right? If you hire a hitman instead of killing someone yourself, that doesn't really make you morally much better off, right? Second, Norcross says, well, look, a lot of people are not really aware of how bad conditions in factory farms are. And Fred knows what he's doing. Maybe ordinary people often don't know what they're doing. But of course, you know what you're doing now because Norcross has told you. So that's not an excuse for you. Sorry. Third, this is sometimes called the causal impotence concern. Somebody might think, well, look, Fred is making a difference to how many animals get mistreated. Fred is mistreating these puppies, and if he doesn't do it, nobody will. But you might think, if I buy factory farmed meat, I am not going to make any difference. So Norcross imagines this person saying, look, agribusiness is way too large to respond to the behavior of one consumer. So I cannot prevent the suffering of any animals, right? If I stop buying meat, it's not going to affect anything. It's just going to be lost amidst a million other consumer decisions. And so I may well think that it's terrible that people do this. I might think that it's not justified. But because I can't make any difference to how many animals get factory farmed, well, I might as well go ahead and enjoy myself. The thought is, look, I can't affect how many animals this huge corporation is going to raise, and so might as well just buy what I want. And Norcross has two responses here. The first involves another story, and he imagines, suppose you go out to lunch with your friend, and he offers you some Kokomon, and that makes your dessert taste a lot better. But then you're like, oh, what is this stuff? You look it up on your phone. You learn that Kokomon is obtained by torturing puppies. And you're shocked that your friend takes it. And he says, well, you know, the Kokomon industry is this enormous industry. It's not going to respond to the behavior of one consumer, so I can't really affect how many puppies get tortured. So, you know, we might as well go ahead and keep using it. Norcross thinks, look, clearly something has gone wrong with your friend's reasoning. Clearly a morally decent person would not keep taking it, even if they thought that it wasn't going to make any difference in the long run. And so he thinks, similarly, you should not keep eating factory farm products. But then there's the second response, and he also doesn't think that the causal impotence claim is even true. This is his second response. So it's true. Maybe the meat industry isn't perfectly sensitive to the loss of one customer, right? It's not like they're tracking the exact number of people who buy meat and then they think, you know, this week it was 100,400,000, blah blah blah. Oh, but this person didn't buy any. Okay, let's raise one fewer chicken. You know, it's not like that, right? But he thinks, nonetheless, they are somehow sensitive to changes in demands, right? If half of people became vegans, then the industry would raise fewer animals, right? Because they wouldn't want to waste so much. So even if they're not perfectly sensitive to every individual, it still must be the case that there is some number of people such that if those people gave up meat, they would make a change, right? Maybe it's not that every time one person gives up meat, they reduce production by one person's worth of meat. Maybe it's every 10,000 people, they reduce production by 10,000 people's worth of meat or something, right? And you might think, okay, well, what if you're just one away from that threshold, right? There's got to be some threshold such that if they hit it, they change how much they make. What if we're one person away from that threshold? Of course, it's very unlikely that we're one person away from the threshold and that you'll be the one who makes the difference. But if you make a difference, you might make a big difference, right? You triggered this big production threshold. So expected utility might suggest giving up factory farm products. Expected utility is this theory about how you make decisions under uncertainty, right? You take how good or bad something would be, and then you multiply it by the chance that it happens, right? So what the thought is, you take this small probability that you make a difference, but then you multiply it by this huge difference that you would make, and then it would still be worthwhile. Right. The industry may not be able to respond to each individual's behavior, but it must respond to the behavior of fairly large numbers. So suppose the industry is sensitive to a reduction in demand for chicken equivalent to 10,000 people becoming vegetarians. And suppose that the average person who eats chicken eats about 25 chickens a year, so that if 10,000 people give up chickens and trigger this threshold, then about 250,000 fewer chickens will be bred per year. So he thinks, okay, well, here it looks like if you give up chicken, you only have a 1 in 10,000 chance of making any difference, right? You don't know how close we are to this 10,000 person threshold, so, presumably assuming that you should just guess we're somewhere randomly located, you should think you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of triggering the threshold. Well, isn't that, so small that you don't need to worry about it? Well, no, because you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of affecting whether 250,000 chickens get factory farmed. And he thinks a 1 in 10,000 chance of saving 250,000 chickens is morally and mathematically equivalent to the certainty of saving 25 chickens. The thought is you take the 1 in 10,000 chance times 250,000 chickens, and that means that's as good as saving 25 chickens in expectation, right? In terms of making decisions under uncertainty. We often accept that even small risks of great harms are unacceptable. That's why we disapprove of parents who fail to secure their children in car seats or with seat belts, or who leave their small children unattended at home, or who drink or smoke heavily during pregnancy, or consider commercial aircraft safety measures. The chances that any of these safety measures, the emergency exits or whatever, or the oxygen masks, the odds that those are going to be used are much less than 1 in 10,000 per flight, right? But if the airline company is like, sorry, got everyone, the oxygen masks are not working on today's flight, but we're just going to go ahead. It's probably going to be fine. I mean, they're correct that it's probably going to be fine. But if it's not fine, everybody might die, right? And a very small chance of everybody on the plane dying, that's not good to run, right? Norcross is thinking, look, a very small chance that you're the person who triggers the threshold and causes 250,000 chickens to be reared under excruciating conditions, that's a really bad risk to run. You shouldn't run that risk, right? Here's maybe a fourth difference, having to do with intention. For Fred, the suffering is a means to the production of Kokomo, right? The suffering of the puppies is actually responsible for the fact that they produce Kokomo. In the case of factory farming, that's not the case. In the case of factory farming, the suffering is not, it's a byproduct of cramming animals into bad conditions and doing all this sort of stuff. It's not the point, though. It's not a necessary part of what you're trying to achieve. It's just a side effect of what you're trying to achieve. But Norcross thinks, okay, that doesn't make any difference either. Suppose that we change the story so that the Kokomon was a mere side effect of the puppy's suffering. You have to pour drain cleaner down the puppy's throat. And this is very painful, and unrelated to the pain, it causes Kokomon to be produced. And he goes, well, that wouldn't make it okay. So that's not an important difference. Fifth potential difference, well, this might be part of what people are actually responding to when they think about the case. These are puppies. And people care more about puppies than they do about pigs, right? But he thinks, look, the fact that they're puppies, that can't be morally significant, right? It can't be that just, it's a fundamental moral principle that puppies are more important than other animals or something. And it's very unlikely, if you think, well, maybe there's something else about puppies, it's very unlikely that there's any property that puppies have that's morally important that no farm animals have, right? maybe you think, puppies are smarter than other animals. First of all, it's not necessarily true. I mean, pigs are about as smart as dogs and so forth. But, I mean, suppose you think, puppies are smarter, they're more loyal, etc. But, I mean, if Fred told the jury, don't worry, I only acquired particularly stupid, morally obtuse, disloyal, and undevoted puppies, we wouldn't think, oh, okay, acquittal, let them go. As long as they're stupid and disloyal puppies, it's fine to do whatever you want to them. No, of course not. So we reach a crossroads. We presumably all agree that Fred's behavior is very bad. On the other hand, most people, I guess, don't think that consuming factory farm products is very bad. Maybe that's not clear. I mean, most people, if you show them those pictures I showed you earlier, maybe most people would say, oh, I guess that is bad. They thought that factory farming was okay, but they were just not thinking so much about what's done to the animals or something. But I guess, lots of people, maybe they're not thinking so much about it, but having not thought much about it, they think factory farming is okay, maybe. But if Norcross is right, these things are morally equivalent, right? Factory farming and Fred's behavior are morally equivalent. So you might think, okay, we've got two options. Norcross wants us to reason in this way. It's wrong to torture puppies for gustatory. If it's wrong to torture puppies for gustatory pleasure, then it's wrong to support factory farming, because these are morally equivalent actions for reasons we just said. And of course, it is wrong to torture puppies for gustatory pleasure, and you know this through direct intuition or something, right? This is just obviously correct. So it must be wrong to support factory farming. But I think this little discussion where he presents these two syllogisms is actually cut out of the section, the reading in your book. But it's part of this paper, and what he goes on to say presupposes this. I don't know why they cut this part out. But however, he points out somebody could also resolve the inconsistency by running the inference the other way. You might say, okay, these things are morally equivalent, factory farming and what Fred does. But, of course, it's not wrong to support factory farming. It's not wrong for me to go to McDonald's and buy chicken nuggets or something. So I guess it must turn out that it's not wrong for Fred to torture the puppies. Now, you might think that just can't be right, that it turns out that it's okay for Fred to torture the puppies, right? And so if you think that can't be right, and if you agree with what Norcross had said so far, there's no morally important difference between supporting factory farming and what Fred does, then it looks like you're committed to agreeing with Norcross's conclusion about the morality of factory farming, right? But if you are inclined to think, okay, well, maybe it turns out that puppy torture is okay, Norcross is still going to give a further argument. He asks, okay, well, suppose we didn't make it puppy torture. Suppose we made it factory farming people, human beings. Would you be okay with that? And he supposes, look, even if you're willing to entertain the idea of it being okay for Fred to torture the puppies, surely you're not going to be okay with the idea of factory farming human beings. If you're okay with that, then, maybe we just, maybe there's just no helping some people, right? Okay, so if you think it's at least not okay to factory farm human beings, but if you think it would be okay to factory farm puppies or pigs or other animals, there must be something about humans that explains why they're so much more morally important, right? There has to be, okay, so Norcross says, tell me, if you agree that you can't factory farm human beings, but you think you can factory farm chickens and pigs and so forth, What is it about the humans that explains why you can do the one and not the other? And here he quotes three philosophers who claim that human interests significantly outweigh animal interests. Now, they're not saying, no, these people are not all saying that animal interests don't matter at all and you can factory farm them. In fact, Marianne Warren and Bonnie Steinbach both think, no, animal interests matter a lot. They don't matter quite as much as human interests, but they still matter a lot, so you still shouldn't be gratuitously cruel to them, and so they agree you shouldn't do factory farming. Carl Cohen, I think, actually thinks that you don't have any obligations to animals and you can do whatever you want. But I say this, you could hold the view that humans are much more important than animals, but you still shouldn't factory farm animals, and you still shouldn't torture puppies and stuff. But Norcross is actually going to press the argument further. So we have three people attempting to explain why is it supposed to be the case that human interests are more important than animal interests. One of them is Marianne Warren. We're going to read her when we talk about abortion later, actually. So she thinks, well, there is one difference between human and non-human nature, which has clear moral relevance. People are at least sometimes capable of being moved to action or inaction by the force of reasoned argument. People can reason, and they can listen to reasoned arguments. And that makes them morally more important. Carl Cohen thinks humans engage in moral reflection. They're morally autonomous. They're members of moral communities. They recognize just claims against their own interests. Humans can engage in moral reflection. They're moral agents. That explains why humans are morally more important than animals. The third is Bonnie Steinbach. Human beings can be held responsible for what they do. They can be expected to reciprocate in a way that non-human animals can't. They have the desire for self-respect. So, humans are morally responsible. Humans can reciprocate. That means if you do something nice for them, they can do something nice for you. You recognize that they have certain rights. They'll recognize that you have the same rights, hopefully. Humans have a desire for self-respect. Animals don't have that. So these are all suggestions of what is it that makes human interests more important than animal interests. And Norcross is going to respond to these suggestions with what is called the argument for marginal cases. And the basic claim behind this argument is anything that you select as the thing that justifies saying that humans are morally more important than animals will either be lacking in some humans or present in some animals. In other words, the thought is anything you point to say, this is why human interests are more important than the interests of animals, that same feature would require you to say that the interests of some humans are more important than the interests of other humans, because that feature won't apply to all humans. And of course, we're all quite reluctant to say that the interests of some humans are inherently more important than the interests of other humans, right? Specifically, in this context, what the argument for marginal cases is supposed to show is that any view that would allow you to factory farm animals would also allow you to factory farm some human beings. And of course, we agreed a minute ago, hopefully we can all at least get behind the idea that you shouldn't factory farm human beings, and so then it looks like we would get the conclusion that you shouldn't factory farm non-human animals. So think about these things that were on the slide a minute ago. The ability to reason, the capacity for moral reflection, the desires for self-respect, etc. There are some humans that don't have the ability to reason or the capacity for moral reflection or the desire for self-respect. Babies or people with certain kinds of brain damage or cognitive disabilities. Do we want to say that these people's interests, they're not nearly as morally important as my interests? Surely not. Do we want to say that it would be okay to factory farm babies? Definitely not, right? And so the thought here is, look, you point to these things that are supposed to explain why humans are more important, but then it turns out not all humans have them. And so if this is supposed to be the thing that makes it not okay to factory farm humans, even though you can factory farm animals, well, because not all humans have it, it would turn out that you could factory farm those humans too. And that seems like a bad result. Now, I think Norcross's view is that human and animal interests are equally important when the interests are equally weighty. This is his actual position. This is a position that was developed by Peter Singer, famously, in a paper called All Animals Are Equal. But it's important to understand exactly what this means. If we say that human and animal interests are equally important, this doesn't mean that, say, pigs should have the right to vote, right? They wouldn't benefit from that, right? Just like babies don't have the right to vote, you know. It also doesn't mean that if, for instance, you know, there's like a human child drowning and, oh no, there's a fly that's drowning too. Which should I save? Oh, you know, random, let me flip a coin. No, of course you should save the human, right? But the thought is that isn't because the human's interests are inherently more important. It's because the human has a stronger interest in continued life, where equally weighty interests are at stake. They're equally important. But the human's interests are weightier than the fly's. Human life is a lot richer than a fly's life, and so it's better to live a human life than a fly life. So the human's life is more valuable. I mean, think about all the experiences that you can have, right? All the valuable experiences that you can have. And then think about, you know, a fly. Like, I mean, who knows if they even have experiences at all. That should say projects and desires right there. You have various desires about the future and that sort of stuff that will be thwarted if you die, and so forth. So it's not saying that, you know, you should always treat humans and animals equally in some crude sense of equal. It's just saying you should treat equally weighty interests equally. And that means if you wouldn't cause a human being immense suffering for some reason, then you shouldn't cause it to an animal either, all else equal, right? Because the animal's interest in not suffering extreme anguish is just as important as your interest in not suffering extreme anguish, if the anguish is really equally severe, right? Now, you could hold this position about the equality of interests that's on the previous slide. You could reject that view. You could reject the view about equality of interests, and you could still think, okay, even though animal interests aren't as important as human interests, they're still important enough that puppy torture is wrong, and so they're still important enough that factory farming is wrong, right? And that's actually the position that Warren and Steinbach take. So you don't have to agree with Norcross's view about the equality of interests in order to agree with his view about factory farming, right? But he does accept the stronger equality thesis. Now, that said, if you're trying to resist Norcross's argument, how might you respond? He thinks, well, one possibility, this argument for marginal cases, right? How would you explain why humans are supposed to be more morally important? He thinks, well, one possibility is, since humans normally have these capacities, normally are capable of understanding reasoned argument and engaging in moral reflection and so forth, all humans should be treated as if they had these capacities. What matters is sort of what is normal for you as what matters is what's normal for your group. What matters is not your own specific abilities, but the group that you're part of and what's normal for that group. Norcross thinks, look, this would seem completely bizarre in most other cases, right? Suppose 10 famous people are on trial in the afterlife. 5 are found guilty, 5 are found not guilty. 4 of the guilty are sentenced to an eternity of torment, but one is granted one of the guilty people is granted an eternity of bliss. 4 of the innocent are granted an eternity of bliss, but one is sentenced to an eternity of torment. How did that happen? Well, the one innocent person who gets sentenced to torment asks, why did I and not the other guilty person get sent to hell? And St. Peter says, well, isn't it obvious? You are a man. Norcross, I guess, is writing this some years ago. He doesn't clearly distinguish between males and men. But look, you're a man. The other men in the trial are all guilty. Therefore, the normal condition for the men in this trial is guilt. The fact that you as an individual are innocent is irrelevant. We're just judging you based on the normal condition for this group that you're part of. Likewise, among the women, only one was guilty, so the normal condition for them was innocence. So all of the men go to hell, and all of the women go to heaven. And of course, that would be completely absurd, right? Nobody would think that made any sense. You need to evaluate people on their own characteristics, not just what is normal for this group that they're part of, right? But then, of course, the thought is, well, you shouldn't evaluate people just based on what's normal for their species or something. And if that's not what you should do, then it turns out that you couldn't get all humans this supposedly superior moral status just by noting that humans normally are reasonable, right? You couldn't justify acting as if all humans have reason just because normally humans have reason, and so forth. And so this way of trying to say that humans are more important than animals, but get all humans to be more important than animals, that doesn't work. Another response defended by Bonnie Steinbach, so this is what Bonnie Steinbach actually says, you might say that the interests of the human beings in question, of babies and so forth, those actually are less morally important than the interests of, say, us. But we're still morally permitted to treat them as if they were as important as our own interests. So the thought is, look, objectively they're really not as important, but, you know, sometimes you can kind of show favoritism and it's okay. So because we're affectionate towards babies and so forth, we can act as if their interests are as important as ours, even though they're really not. And Norcross thinks, well, clearly that's not going to work if you think that babies and so forth really are equally important as other humans. And furthermore, if you use this to defend factory farming animals, if you use this to say, okay, well, yeah, we can factory farm animals, and I guess we could factory farm babies, but, you know, we don't want to, and we don't have to do that if we don't want to. We can act like babies are as important as we are. Well, then it looks like you have to say, okay, we could factory farm babies. We just happen not to want to. But it would be morally permissible if we did, right? We could do it. It's not like they're objectively as important as we are. It's just that we don't really want to do that. But that certainly seems like it's not correct. And so Norcross thinks both of these responses to the argument for marginal cases fail. And so Norcross thinks, look, if we grant that all human interests are equally important, then we have to grant that all animal interests are equally important. because there's nothing that could explain why all human interests are superior to all animal interests. And so he thinks, to take it back to the factory farming question, he's gone into quite convoluted ethical theory here to make this very applied point, but to take it back to the factory farming question, Norcross thinks, look, because there's no way of explaining why human interests as such would be more significant than animal interests, if you think that it's permissible to factory farm humans, you would have, or sorry, to factory farm animals, you would have to also think that it's permissible to factory farm some humans, like babies. And of course you shouldn't think that would be a monstrous thing to think, so you shouldn't think that it's okay to factory farm animals. That's basically Norcross's argument here. Yeah, that's the argument.